18 through 21. Then Jehu gathered all the people and said to them, Ahab served Baal a little, Jehu will serve him much. Now summon all the prophets of Baal, all his worshippers and all his priests. Let no one be missing, for I have a great sacrifice for Baal. Whoever is missing shall not live. But Jehu did it in cunning, so that he might destroy the worshippers of Baal. And Jehu said, Sanctify a solemn assembly for Baal, and they proclaimed it. Then Jehu sent throughout Israel, and all the worshippers of Baal came, so that there was not a man left who did not come. And when they went into the house of Baal was filled from one end to the other.
So I'm not sure when it happened, but at one point in history, something weird happened to sports teams, and I thought I'd start with this. Maybe you have some more information than I do, but once upon a time, there were sports teams, and eventually sports teams became animals. I don't know a lot about sports history, but maybe the first team was in a city and said, oh yeah, we're from this city, but then there were too many and they had to come up with some of their names, and eventually got to a bunch of animals. Broncos, Dolphins, Cubs, Cardinals, Lions, Tigers, and Bears, oh my. And I know you're probably thinking, well, what about the Rockies and the Pirates and the Royals? But then you look at their mascots. The Rockies have a dinosaur, and the Pirates have a parrot, and the Royals have a lion. I did homework. I don't know all this stuff, so. But not all sports teams are animals, but a lot of them are. A lot of them are. And I got to thinking about this because I, of course, like you, through the years, you were probably part of, maybe your school had a mascot or something like that. And I think the idea was it was meant to make the opposing team afraid. So, we're going to play a game against you, and the other team was supposed to think, oh man, we're doomed. We are about to be attacked by some bears or lions, some intimidating factors there. And the general idea is that the team is dangerous. The team is a threat. If you're attacked by dolphins or parrots, maybe not as much, but you better get ready to defend yourself still, So when I was 7 years old, when we lived in Alabama, we lived in Sylacauga, Alabama, and I played on a Little League baseball team. And we weren't the alligators or the rattlesnakes or the sharks. We were the termites. And that was a little disappointing. Oh man, we're doomed. We're about to be attacked by termites. At least it wasn't the roly-polies or something like that, but maybe the founders of the team were onto something. If you think about it, you can imagine at the board meeting and they're trying to come up with different names, different suggestions for team names, the piranhas, the cobras, the scorpions. And then the one guy raises his hand, says, how about termites? And so I bet he had some history. Maybe he'd been dealing with termites recently, maybe the other guys on the board too, and so they thought, yeah, it's a great name for a Little League team. Sure, they're small, but they're incredibly destructive. So I was thinking about my childhood and some of these things, and I was, preparing this lesson, trying to understand sin better, and if I had to pick something from the animal kingdom to represent sin, one good choice would be a termite. Most of the time, sin seems pretty small, but it's incredibly destructive, a lot like termites. It took me forever, by the way. I thought it was termites, and I didn't know what they were. I remember I had to explain to me. Most of the time with termites, the damage that's done isn't obvious right away. You don't see the effects until after a long time, and I thought, yeah, that's kind of like sin. So I was trying to find something in the animal kingdom. Everything looks good on the outside. Meanwhile, sin is gnawing at the foundation, at the walls, at the doors. And one day you look at your house or your life, and you think, what happened? Sin takes small bites you don't notice until the damage is big. And of course, there are sometimes we think of as big sins, but a lot of times I think the damage is done by the tiny little things that just kind of hang out, we let stay in our lives. A million tiny mouths gnawing at the good stuff in your life. And maybe you've never dealt with termites, but we've all dealt with strangers living in our house, like mice or spiders or flies or ants. It's probably more familiar. I don't know if you've had any experience with termites, but I've had experience with the others. And when these things, these critters, they end up living in your life, you really only have two choices. You get rid of them or you get used to them. I shared an apartment with a good friend years ago, and we had cockroaches, and you just kind of got used to it. We couldn't really do anything about it. We had rolled up newspapers in different parts of the apartment because you had to be fast. Well, I think it's true. You either, when it comes to sin, it's kind of the same thing. You only have two choices. You can either get rid of them or you can just get used to them. And I think there's danger of the second happening for a lot of us. When God sent Joel, if you want to look at Joel, you might find this interesting. He sent Joel to Judah with a message, and God wanted to capture the essence of sin, and he picked something else from the animal kingdom. He picked locusts. He's trying to get across the idea of the destructive nature of sin. And locusts are a lot like termites, a million tiny mouths gnawing at all the good stuff. And in Joel chapter 1, I'm going to read a few verses from Joel. We were talking about this in Acts, the class for Acts not too long ago. But Joel 1 is all about locusts. And he's trying to get across the idea. He says, you are losing stuff because of the sin in your life. And he describes this swarm in verse 4. Joel 1:4, what the locust swarm has left, the great locusts have eaten. What the great locusts have left, the young locusts have eaten. What the young locusts have left, other locusts have eaten. He's trying to get across the idea, wave after wave of these things are hitting you, and all the good things in your life are being taken away one bite at a time. And I think that's a really effective analogy that he's making, because, one locust makes one bite, not a big deal. But it becomes cumulative and causes devastation. I think the reason God points out the devastation is even though they've lost so much, he can help them recover. That's part of what the book of Joel is about. It says, now you've lost everything. I can still salvage the situation if they're willing to do things his way, if they respond in an authentic way. Look at Joel 2:12. Talking about repenting, but he does it in such an amazingly powerful way. He describes this, Joel 2:12. Even now, and I love that phrase, you think things are pretty bad, right? I mean, you've lost a lot, made a lot of bad choices, but he says, even now, everything's been stripped away, wave after wave of locusts. He says, even now, declares the Lord, return to me with all your heart. It means to repent with fasting and weeping and mourning. And listen to this, verse 13, rend your heart, not your garments. I don't want you to tear your clothes and put on a show. I want a real reaction. Return to the Lord your God, for he is gracious and compassionate, slow to anger and abounding in love, and he relents from sending calamity. So this is what Christianity is all about. If we're doing things God's ways, doing things his way, you can recover what was lost. First of all, you recover your soul. And then you can recover the good stuff that you lost that was eaten up by sin. He can salvage more than we think. Joel 2:25. Yeah, this one really strikes me. Joel 2:25, the way he puts this. I will repay you for the years the locusts have eaten. The great locust and the young locust and the other locusts and the locust swarm, my great army that I sent among you. Notice that should get our attention. He's not talking about real locusts. It says the years the locusts have eaten. They're not eating their crops. They're eating years. That's what sin does. It eats up our peace of mind. It eats up relationships, our confidence, and ultimately it just eats up years. In the book of Joel, is God trying to explain there's still a chance to get the good things back. It really comes down to whether or not we choose God, whether we're sort of in or all in. In fact, he describes in Joel 3:14 the valley of decision. He says it's time to make a decision. All the mess of life comes down to a decision between God and sin. So today, tomorrow, the rest of the week, we always talk about it, but our days are filled with a bunch of decisions. There are going to be many times throughout the day, instead of choosing God the way he wants us to do something, we choose sin. It's those little battles that I sometimes lose. They come at me and I'm not ready for them, and then I don't do as well as I wanted to. And one of the reasons we make this mistake is we've forgotten how dangerous and destructive sin is. And all through the Old Testament, the threat of sin is made very clear. In fact, that's one thing about the Old Testament that always gets people's attention. Some who criticize it and says it seems like the reaction to sin is so over the top, so drastic and harsh. Joshua 7 is a good example. Remember Achan? They had defeated Jericho, And Achan had buried Jericho's stuff under his tent, and God had said, don't keep any of it. It's a sin. And when the sin is revealed, they stone Achan and his family. And that's it for them. And that seems really harsh. It seems like an overreaction in our minds. Seems like their perception of the situation is off. Something wrong with them. But the truth, the actual truth, is kind of a shocker. It's our perception that's off. Something's wrong with us. That harsh, drastic reaction to sin in the Old Testament, that is a very appropriate response. Over and over, God emphasized one thing in particular: sin cannot be tolerated. He's trying to help us understand the most dangerous thing in existence: sin. It's only 3 letters long, about the size of a termite. But on the day Achan and his family died, hopefully whenever everyone understood, sin is incredibly dangerous. Whether or not Achan and his family survived physically isn't not as important, nowhere near as important as whether or not they survived spiritually. I don't know about that condition. So, things are different now. Under the new covenant, sin is not handled with stoning, and I'm very grateful for the new arrangement. But here's where you and I could end up making a huge mistake. The system has changed, but sin hasn't. Sin is just as devastating as it was the day Achan and his family died. Sin is just as dangerous as it always was. We just fight sin in a different way. Here's 2 Corinthians 10. He describes the battle. He says, now, the game plan is different. The strategy is different. We're in the war room. Let's gather together. Let's find out how we're going to do this. How are we going to fight? Here's 1 Corinthians 10, starting at verse 3. It's a different arrangement as far as the battle. For though we walk in the flesh, we are not waging war according to the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh, but have divine power to destroy strongholds. Remember that word, strongholds. We destroy arguments and every lofty opinion raised against the knowledge of God, and take every thought captive to obey Christ. We don't kill sinners, we kill sins. That's the arrangement now. This new approach sounds less drastic, but it's actually more intense. It's easy to miss. Under the old covenant, it was a matter of attacking the surface of things. The new covenant goes deeper. It infiltrates the heart. It goes to the source. You might think of it as we destroy sin by destroying the nest. It's very important to keep in mind, just because you don't have a stone in your hand doesn't mean sin isn't a big deal anymore. In fact, our sins usually become more of a threat because we don't see them as a threat. Since we've never seen anyone stoned to death for sin, since we're surrounded by people who sin all day long and seem just fine, we lighten up and we let our guard down. And if there's some in our lives, it doesn't seem that much of a big deal. This allows the world to slowly and subtly change our thinking. Eventually we stop noticing sin and we accept it. It takes someone stepping up and saying, don't forget, this is a sin. And we say, oh yeah, that's right. It doesn't seem like it, but I guess it is. A lot of sins seem small, but they're like a million tiny mouths eating up the years, consuming all the good stuff in your life. It's very easy to let our perceptions slip. Even now, it's easy to fall back into the mindset and think sin is mostly not a big deal. I think there's only one solution to this, because I'm in just as much danger as you are of saying this and hearing it and saying, yep, that's a good point, and then nothing changes. So I really think there's only one solution. I have to see our new covenant situation through the lens of the old covenant. It's almost impossible not to notice the old covenant reaction to sin was covered in blood. It's a bloody mess. The old covenant is filled with blood, but so is the new covenant. Under the old covenant, the price was high. The old covenant was drenched in the blood of many guilty people. Achan is just one small example, small percentage of what you read. A lot of people died as a direct result of disobeying God. Under the new covenant, the price is higher. The new covenant is covered in the blood of one person, a perfectly innocent man. Since the price is higher, the situation is more serious, and it's so easy to forget this. We have to battle our New Testament sins in a way with Old Testament intensity. So I asked that 2 Kings 10 be read. David read this for us. I'll give you a little background about what's going on here. Jehu's really admirable. He really wanted to do a good job. He realized his kingdom was being corrupted by sin. And a lot of the kings before him and after him were like, we'll do what we can or not do anything. But Jehu did not mess around. He dealt with sin like he drove. I don't know if you remember, he was a wild driver. And Jehu knew sin for what it was. I'm going to look at 2 Kings 10:19. So he knew that people who opposed God were poison. And so he sets up a fake worship service, a trap. 2 Kings 10:19. And I'm actually not going to focus on him. We're going to look at some other people here in a second. But here's 2 Kings 10:19. Now summon all the prophets of Baal, all his worshipers, and all his priests. Let no one be missing. For I have a great sacrifice for Baal. He's lying. He's not telling the truth. Whoever's missing shall not live. But Jehu did it in cunning so that he might destroy the worshipers of Baal. So when everyone gets there, he's being very careful about this. He has them all change clothes. He says, here's your outfit. Baal worshipers, you put this on. He wants to make sure there's no mix-up. Only worshipers of Baal wear these. And he makes sure he goes through. He says, is anybody who doesn't worship Baal here? He makes sure that there's no mistakes at all. And it says, as David read for us, the house of Baal was filled end to end. All of them are gathered inside and they're waiting for the sacrifice. But here's who I want to talk about. Jehu picks 80 guys. He stationed 80 men outside and he gave them specific instructions to these 80 men. It's in 2 Kings 10:24. Listen to this, how thorough and careful Jehu is about sin. 2 Kings 10:24. Now Jehu had stationed 80 men outside and said, the man who allows any of those whom I give into your hands to escape shall forfeit his life. In other words, guys, one of these people inside the building that gets past you, you're going to pay for it with your life. That's how intense this arrangement is. You can imagine these 80 guys are very focused about the assignment. If one false God worshiper slips past him, he would be executed. It's like being a soccer goalie, but if you miss the block, you die. Seems like overkill to us, but Jehu knew something we forget. One corrupt voice will destroy everything. In fact, you could even say the one little sin that we just kind of shrug at, that's going to be the end of us. It's easy to imagine these 80 men, it's a matter of life and death. They were on their toes that day. Sin was inside the building, and their job was to make sure not one sin escaped. It was probably kind of standing outside a giant Pandora's box, couldn't let anything slip through. Jehu gave them an intimidating assignment, but he made sure they were prepared. He didn't just say, hey, just do this. He didn't just make sure they had a good weapon. They had a good weapon. He made sure they had a good perception. He didn't just say, okay, here's your weapon, don't let anybody escape. He says, no, this is too serious. Don't let anybody escape or it will mean your head. That's what's at stake here. So here we are, surrounded by our sins. Some of them are messing with us. If you're a human being, I think I can vouch for you that that's the case. And a bunch of them are getting through into our heads, into our hearts, and they're showing up in our decisions. We're a lot like those 80 guys, those 80 men standing outside that giant Pandora's box. If you let one sin slip into your life and stay, that could be the end of you. There's a big difference between making a mistake and asking for forgiveness and repenting and moving on. Don't rob yourself of the peace of mind you can have from that. I'm talking about the stuff that stays. But just like them, as Christians, we also have a weapon. The word is described as a sword. We have a good weapon, just like those guys did. But it won't do us any good unless we also have a good perception of the situation. For the safety of our soul, for the safety of the souls around us, we cannot be casual about sin. We cannot let the world tone it down as if it's something small. We can't afford to let one slip by and become a part of our lives. I'm not talking about making mistakes. We all we will always make mistakes. The danger is when we let the mistake continue to live. It's like one of the 80 men, if something gets by you, you chase it down and you end it. So we are no longer under the old covenant, we are under the new covenant. We fight sin in a different way. But it's important to keep the old covenant perception of sin in mind. Sin is just as dangerous as it was back then. It seems small, doesn't seem to do much damage, but it's like a million tiny mouths. If you let it, it'll consume all the good stuff in your life. It already has, but there's a way to get it back. I'm determined. I don't want to lose these things one bite at a time. If you're not a Christian and you haven't been baptized, life will always be a matter of losing things, often in tiny little increments that you won't even notice until a lot of it's gone. If you are a Christian, God has rescued your soul, and He is ready to repair things, and He's ready to make things good again. He's ready to restore the years to you, and I hope you'll take Him up on it. Let's stand together and sing.